Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people I've connected with over the years in the world of arts and entertainment, and today we're doing another in our series about the singers. This time, I'm so glad to have back on the show, Walter Zwol. Welcome back, Walter.
Thank you for having me, Tom. I sincerely appreciate it.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. So last time we spoke, we covered off your career pretty much from the time that you spent with Brutus and onto the Rage and Zwol and all that, but we didn't really talk about singing. So what I really want to know right now is what got you into the idea of being a singer in the first place?
Okay, it's kind of a long story, but we'll just cut to the chase and I'll say that in my early days, I always sat at the keyboards. I was always the keyboard player. I played all the keys on my first solo album, and on the Brutus album, I also played some of the keys, but I had a keyboard player. But at any rate, I used to just sit at the keyboards and sing. So it was kind of strange. For a very brief period, like maybe a month, the group Brutus seemed to be falling apart. And so I was trying to keep it together. Anyway, we got a girl singer. She was from Winnipeg. And on guitar at that time was Jerry Doucette. And at one point, we were in Hamilton doing a show, and Jerry said, would you be opposed to coming up and singing standing up? And I looked at him and I said, no. So I got up and I sang, and I went through my performance moves, and after the song, Jerry looks at me and he says, don't ever sit at the keyboards again. Man, you got it, so get out front. And from that time on, I became a front person. It was a challenge, but something I seemed to rise to fairly naturally. So it was a neat experience and a neat thing Jerry said. And very shortly after that, Jerry moved westward out to Vancouver and, of course, had his own successful career as a solo artist.
Well, there's an awful lot to unpack there, actually. The fact that Jerry Doucette was in your band before he went off on his own and had his own level of success, as you say. But now I'm curious, if we go back even further, most of the people I talk to say that they were inspired by that hypno bean that came out of the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 when the Beatles made their first appearance. But I'm curious, what were your earliest influences in music?
My early influences would have probably been not so much the Beatles. I didn't really, honestly, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this. I listened to the Beatles, got into them, but they didn't really affect me. I guess it was their pop sense. And although I admired it and thought, wow, these guys are, just brilliant writers, beyond that, the people that affected me were more the performance guys. Like when I was 16 and I just started, I think I wasn't until 17 I actually did a live show. And 16, I met my guitar player in school, and we went to see James Brown. And we were absolutely devastated. We went, how the hell are we ever going to do what this band does? It was just showmanship beyond. The playing was spectacular. Then I went to see guys like Roy Orbison, a complete singer and a beautiful singer. And people like Roy or even James Brown on another plane affected me. I also went to see, way back when, Ella Fitzgerald. And I was just starting, jazz had been kind of on the back burner, but I admired it greatly. And I had listened to Ella, and I thought, geez, she's coming to town. And believe it or not, Frank Sinatra was promoting her. They became friends. At any rate, I went to see her, and again, just blown away. And that's when I started to listen to instrumentals, and I got into singing scat, and I totally enjoyed it. I enjoyed the freedom of just when you do those little things in rhythmic. I always admired it, and I play with a bass player who I consider probably one of the best soloists in Canada, a fellow called Pat Kilbride. And he said to me, this would be, probably about 25 years ago, he says, you know what it is, Walt? You have a natural sense of rhythm. And so I think that's why when I heard Ella do scat, I really aspired to that. And it came out of my singing, because even when I'm just doing a pop song, I never try and do it the same way twice. Hence, I'm not a great person to be in a tribute band where you have to kind of do the same thing every night. I like to experiment. I always let the fellas that I played with, even though I was the leader of Brutus or Zwol, I always said, well, what do you want to do here? Or what can you come up with? And I'd work with the guitar player or the bass player or the drummer, and always let people have a free rein. And anyway, that to me has always been like jazz is a free form of music. And I wanted to keep that idea and that energy, that emotion, that creation within the players that I'm working with. And I thought that would be a lot of fun. And it turned out, I guess it was fun because, I spent my life doing it.
And we'll be right back after this. Wow. Again, there's a lot to unpack there, but those are some really incredible singers that you mentioned. And it's interesting to me that your music, your works in my mind are all very commercial sounding, hence why you have been successful in the past. But to have all of those sort of bohemian ideas and so on, that's very interesting. Roy Orbison, I saw him in concert back in the early 80s at the London Gardens here, and it was probably the most powerful vocal performance I've ever seen in my entire life. The emotion and the power that came from that man, I couldn't believe it. And then years later, I found out that he had so much tragedy in his life, and that's, for me, that's where I actually found my soul, was after I lost my son. And I'd always been a mediocre singer prior to that. But Roy Orbison, man, what a power.
Oh, absolutely. Just, so natural. The timbre of his voice, just beautiful. It's like I say with Ella Fitzgerald, she just has this beautiful quality. But then, a lot of people, maybe singers, would not admit this, but honestly, I think Mick Jagger is fantastic. What a expression he has. He really knows naturally what he's doing. And I like his expression as a singer. I like his placement where he does with words. And I even, Freddie Mercury was brilliant. But, so many different artists have affected me, even vocally. Kurt Cobain, it's like most people say, are you kidding? No, I'm not. I liked what he did with his material and where he did phrasing. And that's kind of what I liked about Mick Jagger, too. His phrasing was very interesting and very neat. And then I would go back to, just solo artists. And I guess a guy melodically that really affected me also was a fellow from England called Peter Sarstedt. And you might know Peter from a song called Where Do You Go to My Lovely?
Okay. Editor's note, Peter Sarstedt was in fact a British singer-songwriter instrumentalist, and he did have a huge hit, as Walter mentioned, in 1969 with Where Do You Go My Lovely. He also had a couple of brothers, Eden Kane, who was known as a teenage pop idol in England, and Clive Sarstedt. They also performed together as the Sarstedt brothers. His voice actually reminded me of Cat Stevens crossed with Gordon Lightfoot and Bob Dylan. Now, back to the show.
That song just made me cry. And I listened to him, and a beautiful voice. What a beautiful voice he had. And maybe 10 years later, after discovering him in the very late 60s, I worked with a fellow called Roger Cook, and I mentioned him before. Roger wrote, I'd Like the World to Sing, and Bus Stop, Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress, just a number of hits. And because he was from London, England, I mentioned Peter Sarstedt, and Roger was really taken back, and he said, the guy is gorgeous. He's gorgeous in concert. He's got such a gift. Just a wonderful writer, but a wonderful singer also. And I will just fast forward here to another time. I was having a lot of trouble with my vocal cords, singing, and I was losing my voice. And of course, in the heat of the moment, working every night, 7 nights a week. Anyway, I went to a doctor, and I went to a specialist, ear, nose, and throat, and he said, you work in bars? And I said, I do. At the moment, that's all I was doing. And he said, well, I'm going to check your lungs. And when he did, he could see a lot of the result of secondhand smoke. And those days, of course, everybody was smoking all around the stage, everywhere. You couldn't get away from it. So he said, not much I can do. You have a chronic sort of infection. Do you have to let your phlegm out a lot? And I said, yes, I do. On stage, I always keep a paper towel. And I'm always like releasing myself with phlegm that is built up. He said, I'm sorry to say this, but this looks like a chronic condition. Another thing I'd thought about after I'd seen the doctor, the monitors were terrible. And the band, we were doing a lot of rock. The band was loud and I couldn't never hear myself. So I thought one remedy I should do is probably get a new sound system. So I went out and bought a good sound system, and suddenly, not so much suddenly, but eventually in a very short period of time, all my vocal prowess came back. So even though I was doing 7 nights a week, I could hear myself. And then I started doing like hot tea with honey and easing my throat. I'd get a thermos and bring it on stage and just ease my throat that way. And also I went to a vocal coach and started learning that all my breathing was wrong. And just quickly, as you probably know, one thing you should do, and I have watched little, if you want to call them tutorials, they're really not, but just singers and what they do. And almost everybody, whether it be Tony Bennett, whether it be Ella, just to name 2 very wonderful singers, and I'm sure Roy Orbison has taken these lessons, but breathing from the lower stomach, below the belly button, making sure you have enough air to push up through your throat, and naturally you don't have to, like not so much scream, but you don't have enough air. So that is very important, making sure your breathing is correct. And that took me a little bit of time on stage to catch myself when I was doing it wrong and say, hey, what are you doing here? Don't get into that habit.
That's very interesting, because just yesterday, my wife was playing her mandolin and she was trying to sing a song from the Nashville TV series. And she's not a trained singer, but she said she was having trouble breathing. So she watched a video and she learned to push from the stomach,
Yeah.
And it's something that I always ask in this series. If I were a young person coming up, would you have any advice for me? And we'll get into that in a minute.
One of the most common responses that I get from artists like yourself to that topic is that you need to look after yourself physically and learn how to breathe properly. Aside from that, is there anything specific that you do to look after your voice?
To look after my voice, there's a number of things, actually, as I've had trouble in the past, way back when we were just going absolutely crazy as young kids. The band was so loud and the monitors were terrible, so I was losing my voice, and I went to a doctor and he said, well, I don't know what to tell you, but you definitely have nodes in your throat and whatever. So I went out and got a better sound system, bit the bullet, and just spent, in those days, back in the 70s, and spent $40,000 getting a better system. But after that, I learned through time a number of things, I guess, to sort of help my voice. And I guess one of the things was drinking hot water with honey and lemon and ginger. Those things seem to ease my vocal cords.
And we'll be right back after this.
I also started taking some serious lessons, and with those lessons, I learned how to breathe better as a vocalist. And I'm sure a lot of people out there who do sing have maybe heard this before, but it's so very important to get your air from below your belly button, so in your very lower stomach, to get the air, breathe it in through your nose, and you let it out through your mouth. And I do those exercises. In other words, and what I like to do is, I'm very lucky in that, in fact, I live on a 8-acre condo complex, and there's trees everywhere. So I will go out within the most, I guess, what I'm trying to say is where all the trees are very thick. And that's where the oxygen is. And what I do is I'll stand with my feet apart. I stand very erect, and I get my hands above my head. With my hands above my head, I take in very deep breath through my nostrils, through my nose. Once that air is in my body and I feel it in my lower stomach, I bring my hands down in front of my chest. And as they're in front of my chest, I try and breathe out very slowly to the count of 10, like 10, 9, 8, etc. And I do this, and what it does is not open the cavity in my stomach, but opens my chest. And this process, through a number of years, has helped me breathe better on stage. The other thing I like doing is, of course, with being in the trees there and getting a lot of oxygen, I try and ride my bike. And although I live right in the heart of the city, which the air is not clean, I always, during my bike ride, try and ride on side streets where I don't get a lot of traffic, because obviously vehicular traffic is going to cause carbon monoxide and whatever, and it's really not good for anyone's health. So I try and avoid as much as I can riding on main streets. So, like I said, I guess the gist of the whole conversation and the answer here is, do really try, as a vocalist, to breathe better. Again, through the lower tummy, up into your chest cavity, and expand that whole passage. That will really help. The other thing I do before I have to go and work is to do exercises, vocal exercises. I also play keyboards, so I will do scales. And although they're boring and they're just like, oh no, I have to do this again, well, it's very important just to build. And I go from a low G right up 2 octaves to a higher G. And I try and keep expanding higher than the higher G, or expand lower than the lower G. So I will do that. The other things I listen to, and I've pre-mentioned, I believe, people like Ella Fitzgerald, who has such a pure and beautiful voice. I've tried to listen to her and watch her on video and watch her, I guess, her voice, and just watch her and try and understand the timbre that she's putting forth and how she gets up so high. Now, being a female, she's going to be able to get higher than, per se, myself. Aretha Franklin can really get up to those high notes. And one of my favorite singers, if I've not mentioned her during our conversation, is Anita Baker. And she is also a wonderfully gifted singer. And one of the things I really like about Anita Baker, she writes her own material. So I like the way she expresses herself, because obviously she's written these songs. Or you go to a person like Mick Jagger, And people say, well, Mick Jagger, he's a singer, but he's not a great voice. Just a minute. Listen to him. Listen to his phrasing. Beautiful. The guy is a genius, honestly. As Ella is. Ella with her scat singing. And that's something I really gravitated to. And when I've done a few jazz gigs, one of the bass players or the drummers I've worked with, I'll work with them on stage just spontaneously. And they say, you know what, Walt, your timing is really good. So I try to really concentrate on getting my rhythm together and phrasing. And like I say, with Mick Jagger in rock, he uses very interesting phrasing. He lets his words develop and control him. And he really gets that rhythm and phrasing within the song. And it really works, obviously. They're so successful, not only as writers, but honestly, I just really like what Mick does. I think he's very bright at it.
Well, there's a couple of key points there.
I'm sorry, Tony?
There's a couple of key points that you mentioned there. When you talk about Mick Jagger and how he basically is letting things flow, so that's really important. I find a lot of young singers, especially, you watch them, they're really straining. You can see the veins in their neck sticking out, and they're just so tense. And they're just trying to force the notes out, you know what I mean? And I think that's really important for young singers to understand, is it, like you said, it's about controlling your breathing and letting it flow rather than fighting it and forcing it.
Exactly. And honestly, when you're on stage and, you're on stage, you're on fire, you're in the heat of the moment, you do forget about breathing. I know I did anyway, speaking for myself. So what I did is I'd catch myself and I say, hey, what are you doing? It's very quickly. And then, just in my own self. And I just go, okay, come on now. You've got to get your breathing together here. And so even though I'm on stage and having a great time and whatnot, I try and revert back to that. And that takes time. It's experience. It's just like practicing. Well, gee, am I able to do this scale really quickly or to copy what this guitar player is doing? Or as a drummer, can I do what this fellow's doing? Like a fellow like Steve Gadd. I mean, the man is amazing. That solo, if you ever listened to the solo on Asia, it was in one take. Now that is a fella, Steve Gadd, who's done a lot of practice. And practice makes perfect. So whether you're any player, whether you're a saxophone player and you have to get your breathing together, or a trumpet player, or a vocalist, it's very important to get your breathing together and get it to the point, like you just said, relaxation. And when you're relaxed and you've got that in your back pocket where you're conscious of your breathing and you're still, smiling with the audience and working, when it's comfortable, it flows. And at the end of it all, your voice is stronger.
And you also mentioned writing. That's important because I feel like I have an advantage over cover singers in that I do 95% original material on my live shows and I'm writing in my wheelhouse. So, I read an article, I think it was Michelle Wright that had a column on singing in Canadian Musician magazine years ago. And the one thing that she said is that she sings within her range. And some people are able to stretch it, but I feel like you need to know if you're that person or not and work within your wheelhouse.
Absolutely. And just like with whether the Placido Domingo or Pavarotti, you watch them, and the girls escape me right at the moment, the women opera singers. What you're viewing when you watch them or you listen to, you're watching or listening to an extremely trained, a lot of practice every day, practicing breathing, practicing vocals, getting that voice where it's pure and delivering it properly. And someone like a Pavarotti, like a Ella Fitzgerald, fortunate for them, they're natural. They're very natural singers. So a person like myself, who doesn't have that, per se, maybe as good as they have, a very natural ability, I have to work at it. And most people do. Most musicians, and great musicians, have to work at it. We all have to practice and study. Yes, we do hear the people that are just unbelievable technicians, like a Charlie Parker, a sax player. I mean, the man was an unbelievable player, and he had technique in his back pocket. Very lucky. But there's other people that had to work at it, and they rose to the occasion. So for each and every one of us, we have to work at practicing our breathing, practicing getting our range a little better. And that all comes with time. And so practice makes perfect.
Absolutely.
And that's what needs to be done.
Well, that's sage advice, Walter. I know that you've got things to do. I don't want to keep you all day. I want to thank you once again for taking the time out of your day to do this with me. And until next time, cheers.
Tommy, thank you very kindly. Sincerely appreciated for having me. And I hope I've answered some questions for you, and people listening are able to actually put it into practice. Thank you very much once again. I sincerely appreciate it.
All the best. Well, it's hard to find a guy who is as talented and as accomplished as Walter Zwol and yet is so humble. Man, I tell you, what a sweetheart of a guy. Now, Walter has a show coming up September 23rd, 2023 with the Cameo Blues Band at High Hope Farm at 5450 Lake Ridge Road in Ashburn, near Pickering, Ontario. It's from noon till 4 p.m. This should be a great show. So if you're in the GTA, you should check that out. Now here, without further ado, for your listening pleasure, is Walter Zwol, and Call Out My Name from 1979's release, Zwol. This is still available. In fact, all of Walter Zwol's music is available at bandcamp.com under the Bullseye Records label. So check that out, and by all means, help support Walter and all of your other favorite musicians by actually paying for our music. Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including recording, editing, guest acquisition, etc. And hey, here's some news. We've just recently joined forces with 519 Magazine, so you can check out my interviews there as well. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn, all rights reserved. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help us keep it going, why don't you click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that stuff. We really appreciate it. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, cheers.